Chapter 6. Making the Customers. Poll on the morning of Tuesday, November 19, 1963. A well-dressed but haggard-looking man in his middle 30s presented himself at the executive offices of the New York Stock Exchange at 11 Wall Street with the announcement that he was Morton Kammerman, managing partner of the brokerage firm of Ira Hopte Company, a member of the stock exchange, and that he wanted to see Frank J. Coyle, head of the exchange's member firm's department. After checking, a receptionist explained politely that Mr. Coyle was tied up in a meeting, whereupon the visitor said that his mission was an urgent one and asked to see Robert M. Bishop, the department's second in command. Bishop, the receptionist found, was unavailable too. He was tied up with an important phone call. At length, Kammerman, who seemed to be growing more and more distracted, was ushered into the presence of a less exalted exchange official named George H. Newman. He then duly delivered his message that, to the best of his belief, the capital reserve of the Hopte firm had fallen below the exchange's requirements for member firms, and that he was formally reporting the fact in accordance with regulations. While this startling announcement was being made, Bishop, in a nearby office, was continuing his important telephone conversation, the second party to which was a knowledgeable Wall Streeter whom Bishop has since declined to identify. The caller was telling Bishop he had reason to believe that two stock exchange member firms, J.R.U. Williston I.C. Bean, Inc. and Ira Hopte Company, were in financial trouble serious enough to warrant the exchange's attention. After hanging up, Bishop made an inter-office call to Newman to tell him what he had just heard. To Bishop's surprise, Newman already had the news, or part of it. "As a matter of fact, Kammerman is right here with me now," he said. In this humdrum setting of office confusion, there began one of the most trying, and in some ways one of the most serious, crises in the stock exchange's long history. Before it was over, this crisis had been exacerbated by the greater crisis resulting from the assassination of President Kennedy, and out of it the stock exchange, which has not always been noted for acting in the public interest and, indeed, had been accused only a few months before by the Securities and Exchange Commission of an antisocial tendency to conduct itself like a private club, emerged temporarily poorer by almost $10 million, but incalculably richer in the esteem of at least some of its countrymen. The event that had brought Hopte and Williston's Bean into straitened circumstances is history, or rather, future history. It was the sudden souring of a huge speculation that these two firms, along with various brokers not members of the stock exchange, had become involved in on behalf of a single customer, the Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Company of Bayonne, New Jersey. The speculation was in contracts to buy vast quantities of cottonseed oil and soybean oil for future delivery. Such contracts are known as commodity futures, and the element of speculation in them lies in the possibility that by delivery date, the commodity will be worth more or less than the contract price. Vegetable oil futures are traded daily at the New York Produce Exchange, at 2 Broadway, and at the Board of Trade in Chicago, and they are bought and sold on behalf of customers by about 80 of the 400 NERN firms that belong to the stock exchange and conduct a public business. On the day that Kammerman came to the exchange, the Hopte firm was holding for Allied, on credit, so many cottonseed, oil, and soybean oil contracts that the change of a single penny per pound in the prices of the commodities meant a $12 million change in the value of the Allied account with Hopte. On the 2 previous business days, Friday the 15th and Monday the 18th, the prices had dropped an average of a little less than 1.5 cents per pound, and as a result, Hopte had demanded that Allied put up about $15 million in cash to keep the account seaworthy. Allied had declined to do this, so Hopte, like any broker when a customer operating on credit has defaulted, was faced with the necessity of selling out the Allied contracts to get back what it could of its advances. The suicidal extent of the risk that Hopte had undertaken is further indicated by the fact that while the firm's capital in early November had amounted to only about $8 million, it had borrowed enough money to supply a single customer, Allied, with some $37 million to finance the oil speculations. Worse still, as things turned out, it had accepted as collateral for some of these advances enormous amounts of actual cottonseed oil and soybean oil from Allied's inventory, the presence of which in tanks at Bayonne was attested to by warehouse receipts stating the precise amount and kind of oil on hand. Hopte had borrowed the money it supplied Allied with from various banks, passing along most of the warehouse receipts to the banks as collateral. All this would have been well and good if it had not developed later that many of the warehouse receipts were forged. That much of the oil they attested to was not, and probably never had been, in Bayonne and that Allied's president Anthony DeAngelis, who was later sent to jail on a whole parcel of charges, had apparently pulled off the biggest commercial fraud since that of Ivor Kruger, the Match King. Where was the missing oil? How could Allied's direct and indirect creditors, including some of the most powerful and worldly wise banks of the United States and Great Britain, have been so thoroughly gulled? Would aggregate losses on the whole debacle finally total $150 million, as some authorities had estimated, or would the bill be even bigger? How could a leading stock exchange firm like Haupt have been so foolish as to take on such an inconceivably risky commitment for a single customer? These questions had not even been raised, let alone answered, on November 19th. Some of them have not been answered yet, and some of them may not be answered for years. What began to emerge on November 19 and what became clear in the harrowing days that followed was that in the case of Haupt, which had about 20,000 individual stock market customers on its books, and in the case of Williston Bean, which had about 9,000, the impending disaster directly involved the personal savings of many totally innocent persons who had never heard of Allied and had only the vaguest notion of what commodity trading is. Kamerman's report to the stock exchange did not mean that Haupt had gone broke, and at the time he made it, Kamerman himself surely did not think that his firm had gone broke. There's a great difference between insolvency and a mere failure to meet the exchange's rather stringent capital requirements, which are intended to provide a margin of safety. Indeed, various stock exchange officials have said that on that Tuesday morning they did not consider the Haupt situation to be especially serious, while the Williston Bean situation, it was clear from the first, was even less so. One of the first reactions in the member firm's department was chagrin that Kamerman had come to the exchange with this problem before the exchange, through its elaborate system of audits and examinations, had discovered the problem for itself. This, the exchange insists stubbornly, if a bit lamely, was a matter of bad luck rather than bad management. As a matter of routine, the exchange required each of its member firms to fill out detailed questionnaires on its financial condition several times a year. And as an additional check, an expert accountant from the exchange staff descended unexpectedly on each member firm at least once a year to subject its books to a surprise inspection. Ira Haupt Company had filled out its most recent questionnaire early in October, and since the huge buildup in Allied's commodities position with Haupt took place after that, the questionnaire showed nothing amiss. As for the surprise inspection, the exchange's man was in the Haupt offices conducting it at the very time the trouble broke. The auditor had been there for a week, his nose buried in Haupt's account books, but the task of conducting such an inspection is a tedious one, and by November 19th the auditor hadn't got around to examining the Haupt Commodities department. They had set our man up with a desk in a department where nothing unusual was going on. An exchange official has since said, "It's easy to say now that he should have smelled trouble, but he didn't." At mid-morning on Tuesday the 19th, Coyle and Bishop sat down with Kamerman to see what needed to be done about Haupt's problem and what could be done. Bishop remembers that the atmosphere of the meeting was by no means grim. According to Kamerman's figures, the amount of capital that Haupt needed to bring it up to snuff was about $180,000, an almost paltry sum for a firm of Haupt's size. Haupt could make up the deficiency either by obtaining new money from outside or by converting securities it owned into cash. Bishop urged the latter course as the quicker and surer, whereupon Kamerman telephoned his firm and instructed his partners to begin selling some of their securities at once. The difficulty apparently was going to be solved as simply as that. But during the rest of the day after Kamerman had left 11 Wall, the crisis showed a tendency to go through the process that in political circles had come to be called escalation. In the late afternoon, an ominous piece of news arrived. Allied had just filed a voluntary bankruptcy petition in Newark. Theoretically, the bankruptcy did not affect the financial position of its former brokers, since they held security for the money they had supplied Allied with. Nevertheless, the news was alarming in that it provided a hint of worse news to follow. Such news, indeed, was not long in coming. The same evening, word reached the stock exchange that the managers of the New York Produce Exchange, in an effort to forestall chaos in their market, had voted to suspend all trading in cottonseed, oil futures until further notice, and to require notice and to require immediate settlement of all outstanding contracts at a price dictated by them, since the dictated price would have to be a low one. This meant that any remaining chance that Haupt or Williston Bean had of getting out from under the Allied speculations on favorable terms was gone. In the member firm's department that evening, Bishop was frantically trying to get in touch with Keith Funston, the president of the stock exchange, who was first at a midtown dinner and then on a train bound for Washington, where he was scheduled to testify the next day before a congressional committee. What with one thing and another, Bishop was busy in his office all evening. Toward midnight, he found himself the last man in the member firm's department, and, having decided it was too late to go home to Fanwood, New Jersey, for the night he collapsed on a leather couch in Coyle's office. He had a restless night there. The cleaning women were considerately quiet, he said afterward, but the phones kept ringing all night long. Promptly at 9:30 on Wednesday morning, the Stock Exchange's Board of Governors met in the 6th floor governor's room, which, with its regal red carpet, fierce old portraits, and fluted gilt columns, carries rather uncomfortable connotations of Wall Street's checkered past, and, in accordance with exchange regulations, voted to suspend Haupt and Williston Bean because of their capital difficulties. The suspension was made public a few minutes after trading opened, at 10 o'clock, by Henry M. Watts, Jr., chairman of the Board of Governors, who ascended a rostrum that overlooks the trading floor, rang the bell that normally signals the beginning or ending of a day's trading, and read an announcement of it. From the point of view of the public, the immediate effect of the action was that the accounts of the almost 30,000 customers of the two suspended firms were now frozen. That is, the owners of the accounts could neither sell their stocks nor get their money out. Touched by the plight of these unfortunates, the stock exchange brass now set about trying to help the beleaguered firms raise enough capital to lift the suspensions and free the accounts. In the case of Williston Ace Bean, its efforts were triumphantly successful. It developed that this firm needed about $500,000 to get back into business, and so many fellow brokers came forward to help out with loans that the firm actually had to fight off unwanted offers. The $500,000 was finally accepted partly from Walston Company and partly from Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner, Smith. Cozily, the Bean of Williston Bean was the very man who had been the caboose when the firm's name was Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner Bean. Restored to financial health by this timely injection of capital, Williston Bean was relieved of its suspension, and its 9,000 customers were relieved of their anxiety just after noon on Friday, or slightly more than 2 days after the suspension had been imposed. But in the case of Haupt, things went differently. It was clear by Wednesday that the capital shortage figure of $180,000 had been the rosiest of dreams. Even so, it appeared that the firm might still be solvent despite its losses on the forced sale of the oil contracts. On one condition. The condition was that the oil and Bayona tanks that Allied had pledged to Haupt as collateral, and that now, through Allied's default, belonged to Haupt, could be sold to other oil processors at a fair price. Richard M. Crooks, an exchange governor who, unlike nearly all his colleagues, was an expert on commodities trading, figured that if the Bayona oil were thus unloaded, Haupt might still end up slightly in the black. He therefore telephoned a couple of the country's leading vegetable oil processors and urged them to bid on the oil. The replies he received were unanimous and startling. The leading processors declined to make any bid at all, and they left Crooks with the feeling that they were suspicious of the Bayonne warehouse receipts held by Haupt, that they suspected some or all of them to be forgeries. If these suspicions were well-founded, it would follow that some or all of the oil attested to by the receipts was not in Bayonne. The situation was very simple, Crooks has said. Warehouse receipts are accepted in the commodities business as practically as good as currency, and now the possibility had been raised that millions of dollars of Haupt's assets consisted of counterfeit money. Still, all that Crooks knew, definitely on Wednesday morning, was that the processors would not bid on Allied oil, and throughout the rest of Wednesday and all day Thursday, the exchange furiously went on trying to help Haupt get back on its feet along with Williston Bean. Needless to say, the 15 partners of Haupt were busy at the same endeavor, and in aid of it, Kammerman told the Times buoyantly on Wednesday evening, Ira Haupt Company is solvent and is in an excellent financial position. Also, on Wednesday evening, Crooks had dinner in New York with a veteran commodities broker from Chicago. Although I'm an optimist by temperament, my experience tells me that these things always turn out to be much worse than they look at first, Crooks said recently. I mentioned this to my broker friend, and he agreed. The next morning at about 11:30, he called me and said, Dick, this thing is 100% worse than even you think." A bit later, at midday on Thursday, the exchange's member firm's department learned that many of Allied's warehouse receipts were indeed fake. As nearly as can be determined, the Hooped partners were making the same unhappy discovery at about the same time. At any rate, a number of them did not go home Thursday evening, but spent the night at their offices at 111 Broadway, trying to figure out what their position was. Bishop got home to Fanwood that night, but he found that he could sleep hardly any better there than on Coyle's couch. Accordingly, he rose before dawn, took the Jersey Central's 5-8 to the city, and, on a hunch, went to the Haupt offices. There, in the partners area, recently redecorated with modern contoured chairs, marble-topped filing cabinets, and refrigerators disguised as desks, he found several of the partners unshaven and unkempt, drowsing in their chairs. "They were pretty shot by then," Bishop said later, "and no wonder." After being awakened, they told him that they had been up all night calculating, and that at about 3 o'clock they had come to the conclusion that their position was hopeless. In view of the worthlessness of the warehouse receipts, the Haupt firm was insolvent. Bishop took this disastrous intelligence with him to the stock exchange, where he waited for the sun to come up and for everyone else to come to work. At 1:40 on Friday afternoon, when the stock market was already badly rattled by the rumors of Haupt's impending failure, the first reports of the president's assassination reached the exchange floor in garbled form. Crooks, who was there, says that the first thing he heard was that the president had been shot. The second was that the president's brother, the attorney general, had also been shot, and the third was that the vice president had had a heart attack. "The rumors came like machine gun bullets," Crooks says, "and they struck with comparable impact. In the next 27 minutes, during which no hard news arrived to relieve the atmosphere of apocalypse, the prices of stocks declined at a rate unparalleled in the exchange's history. In less than half an hour, the values of listed stocks decreased by $13 billion, and they would no doubt have dropped further if the Board of Governors had not closed the market for the day at 7 minutes past 2. The panic's immediate effect on the Haupt situation was to make the status of the 20,000 frozen accounts far worse, because now, in the event of Haupt's bankruptcy and the consequent liquidation of many of the accounts, the cashing in would have to be done at panic prices, with heavy losses to the account's owners. A larger and less calculable effect of the events in Dallas was paralyzing despair. However, Wall Street, or rather some Wall Streeters, had a psychological advantage over the rest of the country in that there was work at hand to be done. This convergence of disasters confronted them with a definable task. Having testified in Washington on Wednesday afternoon, Funston had returned to New York that evening and had spent most of Thursday as well as Friday morning working on getting Willistern Bean back in business. Sometime during that period, as it was gradually made clear that Haupt was not merely short of capital, but actually insolvent, Funston became convinced the exchange and its member firms must consider doing something virtually unprecedented, that is, reimburse the innocent victims of Haupt's imprudence with their own money. The nearest thing to a precedent for such action was the case of DuPont. Homsey Company, a small stock exchange firm that went bankrupt in 1960 as a result of fraud by one of its partners. The exchange then repaid the firm's customers the money they had been divested of, about $800,000. Now, having hurried back to his office from a lunch date shortly before the emergency closing of the market, Funston set about putting his plan into action, calling about 30 leading brokers whose offices happened to be nearby and asking them to trot over to the exchange immediately as unofficial delegation representing its membership. Shortly after 3 o'clock, the brokers were assembled in the South Committee Room, a somewhat smaller version of the governor's room, and Funston set before them the facts of the Haupt case as he then knew them, along with an outline of his plan for a solution. The facts were these. Haupt owed about $36 million to a group of United States and British banks. Since over 20 million of its assets were represented by warehouse receipts that now appeared to be worthless, there was no hope that Haupt could pay its debt. In the normal course of events, therefore, Haupt would be sued by the creditor banks when the courts reopened next week. The cash and many of the securities held by Haupt for its customers would be tied up by the creditors, and, according to Funston's liberal estimate, some of the customers might end up getting back after an extended period caused by legal delays, no more than 65 cents on the dollar. And there was another side to the case. If Haupt were to go into bankruptcy, the psychological effect of this, combined with the palpable effect of Haupt's considerable assets being thrown on the market, might well lead to further depression of a stock market already in wild retreat at a time of grave national crisis. Not only the welfare of the Haupt customers was at stake then, but perhaps the national welfare too. Funston's plan, simple enough in outline, was that the stock exchange or its members put up enough money to enable all the Haupt customers to get back their cash and securities, to be once again whole in the banking expression. The banking expression is etymologically sound. Whole derives from the Anglo-Saxon hal, which meant uninjured or recovered from injury, and from which heil is also derived. Funston further proposed that Haupt's creditors, the banks, be persuaded to defer any efforts to collect their money until the customers had been taken care of. Funston estimated that the amount needed to do the job might run to $7 million, or even more. Almost to a man, the assembled brokers agreed to support this public, spirited, if not downright eleemosynary, plan. But before the meeting was over, a difficulty arose. Now that the stock exchange and the member firms had decided on a deed of self-sacrifice, the problem confronting each side, to a certain extent anyway, was how to arrange to have the other side do the sacrificing. Funston urged the member firms to take over the entire matter. The firms declined this suggestion with thanks and countered by urging the stock exchange to handle it. "If we do," Funston said, "you'll have to repay us the amount we pay out." Out of this, not very dignified dialogue, emerged an agreement that initially the funds would come out of the exchange's treasury, with repayment to be apportioned among the member firms later. A three-man committee headed by Funston was empowered to conduct negotiations to bring the deal off. The chief parties that needed negotiating with were Haupt's creditor banks. Their unanimous consent to the plan was essential, because if even one of them insisted on immediate liquidation of its loans, the pot would fall in, as the exchange's chairman, Henry Watts, a fatherly-looking graduate of Harvard and of Omaha Beach, 1944, pungently put it. Prominent among the creditors were four local banks of towering prestige: Chase Manhattan, Morgan Guaranty Trust, First National City, and Manufacturers Hanover Trust, which among them had lent Haupt about $18.5 million. Three of the banks have remained notably reticent about the exact amount of their ill-fated loans to Haupt, but blaming them for their silence would be like blaming a poker player who is less than garrulous about a losing night. The Chase, however, has said that Haupt owed it $5,700,000. Earlier in the week, George Champion, chairman of the Chase, had telephoned Funston. Not only did the stock exchange have a friend at Chase, Champion assured him, but the bank stood ready to give any help it could in the Haupt matter. Funston now called Champion and said he was ready to take him up on his offer. He and Bishop then began to try to assemble representatives of the Chase and the three other banks for an immediate conference. Bishop remembers that he felt highly bearish about the chances of rounding up a group of bankers at 5 o'clock on a Friday, even such an exceptional Friday as this one. But to his surprise, he found practically all of them at their battle stations and willing to come straight to the exchange. Funston and his fellow negotiators for the exchange, Chairman Watts and Vice Chairman Walter N. Frank, conferred with the bankers from shortly after 5 until well into the dinner hour. The meeting was constructive, if tense. First, we all agreed that it was a devil of a situation all around, Funston subsequently recalled. Then we got down to business. The bankers, of course, were hoping that the exchange would pick up the whole thing, but we quickly disabused them of that notion. Instead, I made them an offer. We would put up a certain sum in cash solely for the benefit of the Haupt customers. In exchange for every dollar that we put up, the banks would defer collection. That is, would temporarily refrain from foreclosing on $2. If, as we then estimated, $22.5 million was needed to make Haupt solvent, we would put up $7.5, and the banks would defer collection of $15. They weren't so sure about our figures. They thought we were too low, and they insisted that the exchange's claim to get back any of its contribution out of Haupt assets would have to come after the bank's claims for their loan. We agreed to that. We all fought and negotiated, and when we finally went home, there was general agreement on the broad outline of the thing. Of course, everyone recognized that this meeting was only preliminary. To begin with, by no means all the creditor banks were represented at it, and that both the detail work and much of the hard bargaining would have to be done over the weekend. Just how much detail work and hard bargaining lay ahead became manifest on Saturday. The exchange's board met at 11, and more than two-thirds of its 33 members were present. Because of the Haupt crisis, some governors had canceled weekend plans. and others had flown in from their regular stance in such outposts as Georgia and Florida. The board's first action, a decision to keep the exchange closed on Monday, the day of the president's funeral, was accomplished with deep relief because the holiday would give the negotiators an additional 24 hours in which to hammer out a deal before the deadline represented by the Medline represented by reopening of the courts and the markets. Funston brought the governors up to date on what was known about Haupt's financial position and on the status of the negotiations that had been begun with the banks. He also gave them a new estimate of the sum that might be required to make the Haupt customers whole, $9 million. After a fractional moment of silence, several governors rose to say, in essence, that they felt that more than money was at stake. It was a question of the relation of the stock exchange to the country's many million investors. The meeting was then temporarily adjourned, and with the authority of the governor's lofty sentiments to back it up, the exchange's three-man committee got down to negotiations with the bankers. Thus, the pattern for Saturday and Sunday was set. While the rest of the nation sat stupefied in front of its television sets, and while the downtown Manhattan streets were as deserted as they must have been during the yellow fever epidemics of the early 19th century, the sixth floor of 11 Wall Street was a nexus of utterly absorbed activity. The exchange's committee would remain closeted with the bankers until a point was reached at which Funston and his colleagues needed further authorization. Then the Board of Governors would go into session again and either grant the new authority or decline to do so. Between sessions, the governors congregated in the hallways or smoked and brooded in empty offices. An ordinarily obscure corner of the exchange bureaucracy called the Conduct and Complaints Department was having a busy weekend too. A staff of half a dozen, there was continuously on the phone dealing with anxious inquiries from Haupt customers who were feeling anything but hail. And, of course, there were lawyers everywhere. I never saw so many lawyers in my life, one veteran stock exchange man has said. Coyle estimates that there were more than 100 people at 11 Wall Street during most of the weekend. And since practically all local restaurants as well as the exchange's own eating facilities were closed, the food problem was acute. On Saturday, the entire output of a downtown lunch counter that had shrewdly stayed open was bought up and consumed, after which a taxi was dispatched to Greenwich Village for more supplies. On Sunday, one of the exchange secretaries thoughtfully brought in an electric coffee maker and a huge bag of groceries and set up shop in the chairman's dining room. The bankers' negotiating committee now included men from two Haupt creditors that had not been represented on Friday, the National State Bank of Newark and the Continental Illinois National Bank Trust Company of Chicago. Still unrepresented were the four British creditors, Henry Ansbasher Company, William Brandt Sons Company Limited, S. Jaffeta Company Limited, and Kleinwort Benson Limited. Moreover, with the weekend half gone, they seemed to be temporarily unrepresentable. It was decided to continue negotiating without the British banks and then, on Monday morning, present any agreement to them for approval. A crucial point at issue, it now developed, was the amount of cash that would be needed from the stock exchange to fulfill its part of the bargain. The bankers accepted Funston's formula under which they would defer collection of $2 for every dollar that the exchange contributed to the cause. And they did not doubt that Haupt was stuck with about $22.5 million worth of useless warehouse receipts. However, they were unwilling to take that figure as the maximum amount that might be necessary to liquidate Haupt. To be on the safe side, they argued, the amount ought to be based on Haupt's overall indebtedness to them, $36 million, and this meant that the exchange's cash contribution would have to be not $7.5 million but $12 million. Another point at issue was the question of to whom the exchange would pay whatever sum was agreed upon. Some of the bankers thought the money ought to go straight into the coffers of Ira Haupt Company, to be dispensed by the firm itself to its customers. The trouble with this suggestion, as the exchange's representatives were not slow to point out, was that it would put the exchange's contribution entirely beyond its control. As a final complication, one bank, the Continental Illinois, was distinctly reluctant to enter into the deal at all. The Continental's people were thinking in terms of their bank's exposure, an exchange man has explained sympathetically. They thought our arrangement might ultimately be more damaging to them than a formal Haupt bankruptcy and receivership. They needed time to consider, to make sure they were taking the proper action, but I must say they were cooperative. Indeed, since it was primarily the stock exchange's good name that was at the center of the planned deal, it would appear that all the banks were marvels of cooperation. After all, a banker is legally and morally charged with doing the best he can for his depositors and stockholders, and is therefore hardly in a position to indulge in grand gestures for the public good. If his eyes are flinty, they may mask a kind but stifled heart. As for the Continental, it had reason to be particularly slow to act, because its exposure amounted to well over $10 million, or much more than that of any other bank. No one concerned has been willing to say exactly what the points were on which the Continental held out, but it seems safe to assume that no bank or person who had lent Hawat less than $10 million can know exactly how the Continental felt. By the time the negotiations were recessed, at about 6 o'clock Saturday evening, a compromise had been reached on the main issues. On the amount of cash controversy, by an agreement that the exchange would put up an initial $7.5 million with a pledge to go up to $12 million if it became necessary, and on the controversy about how the money would be paid to the Hop customers by agreement that the exchange's chief examiner would be appointed liquidator of Hawat. But the Continental was still recalcitrant, and of course the British banks had not yet even been approached. In any event, everybody shut up shop for the night, with pledges to return early the next afternoon, even though it was Sunday. Funston, who was coming down with a bad cold, went home to Greenwich. The bankers went home to places like Glen Cove and Basking Ridge. Watts, a die-hard commuter from Philadelphia, went home to that tranquil city. Even Bishop went home to Fanwood. At 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon, the exchange governors, their ranks now augmented by arrivals from Los Angeles, Minneapolis, Pittsburgh, and Richmond, met in joint session with the 30 representatives of member firms who were anxious to learn what they were being committed to. After the current status of the emerging agreement had been explained to them, they voted unanimously in favor of going ahead with it. As the afternoon progressed, even Continental Illinois softened its opposition, and at about 6 o'clock, after a series of frantic long-distance telephone calls and attempts to track down Continental officers on trains and in airports, the Chicago Bank agreed to go along, explaining that it was doing so in the public interest rather than in pursuance of its officers' best business judgment. At about the same time, the Times financial editor Thomas E. Mullaney, who, like the rest of the press, had been rigidly excluded from the sixth floor throughout the negotiations, called Funston to say he had heard rumors of a plan on Hop in the offing, because the British banks would have reason to be miffed, at the very least, if they should read in the next morning's air editions of a scheme to dispose of their credits without their agreement, or even their knowledge. Funston had to give a reply that could only depress still further the spirits of the waiting 20,000 customers. There is no plan, he said. The question of who would undertake the delicate task of cajoling the British banks had come up early Sunday afternoon. Funston, despite his cold, was anxious to make the trip. For one thing, he has since admitted the trauma of it appealed to him, and had gone as far as getting his secretary to reserve space on a plane. But as the afternoon progressed and the local problems continued to appear intractable, it was decided that he couldn't be spared. Several other governors quickly volunteered to go, and one of them, Gustav L. Levy, was eventually selected on the ground that his firm, Goldman Sachs Company, had had a long and close association with Kleinwort Benson, one of the British banks, and that Levy himself was on excellent terms with some of the Kleinwort Benson partners. Levy would later succeed Watts as chairman. Accordingly, Levy, accompanied by an executive and a lawyer of the chase, who were presumably included in the hope that they would set the British banks an inspiring example of cooperation, left 11 Wall Street shortly after 5 o'clock and caught up. London, bound jet at 7. The trio sat up on the plane most of the night, carefully planning the approach they would make to the bankers in the morning. They were well advised to do so, because the British banks certainly had no cause to feel cooperative. Their stock exchange wasn't in trouble, and there was more to it than that. According to unimpeachable sources, the 4 British banks had lent Haupt a total of $5.5 million, and these loans, like many short-term loans made by foreign banks to American brokers, had not been secured by any collateral. Sources only fractionally more impeachable maintain that some of the loans had been extended very recently. That is, a week or less before the debacle. The money lent is known to have consisted of Eurodollars, a phantom but nonetheless serviceable currency consisting of dollar deposits in European banks. Some 4 billion Eurodollars were actively traded among European financial institutions at that time, and the banks that lent the $5.5 million to Haupt had first borrowed them from somebody else. According to a local expert in international banking, Eurodollars are customarily traded in huge blocks at a relatively tiny profit. For instance, a bank might borrow a block at 4.25% and lend it at 4.5% at a net advantage of 1/4% per annum. Obviously, such transactions are looked upon as practically without risk. 1/4% of $5.5 million over a period of 1 week amounts to $264.42, which gives some indication of the size of the profit on the Haupt deal that the 4 British banks would have been able to divide among themselves. Less expenses if everything had gone as planned. Instead, they now stood to lose the whole bundle. Levy and the Chase men arrived red-eyed in London shortly after daybreak on a depressingly drizzly morning. They went to the Savoy to change their clothes and have breakfast and then headed straight for the city, London's financial district. Their first meeting was at the Fenchurch Street establishment of William Brandt's Sons, which had put up over half of the $5.5 million. The Brandt partners courteously offered condolences on the death of the president, and the Americans agreed that it was a terrible thing, whereupon both sides came to the point. The Brandt men knew of Haupt's impending failure, but not of the plan now afoot to rescue the Haupt customers by avoiding a formal bankruptcy. Levy explained this, and an hour's discussion followed, in the course of which the Britons showed a certain reluctance to go along. As well they might. Having just been taken in by one group of Yankees, they were not anxious to be immediately taken in by another. They were very unhappy, Levy says. They raised hell with me as a representative of the New York Stock Exchange, one of whose members had got them into this jam. They wanted to make a trade with us, to get a priority in the collection of their claims in exchange for coming along with us and agreeing to defer collection. But their trading position wasn't really good. In a bankruptcy proceeding, their claims, based on unsecured loans, would have been considered after the claims of creditors who held collateral. And in my opinion, they would have never collected a nickel. On the other hand, under the terms of our offer, they would be treated equally with all the other Haupt creditors except the customers. We had to explain to them that we weren't trading. The Brandt men replied that before deciding they wanted to think the matter over, and also to hear what the other British banks said. The American delegates then repaired to the London office of the Chase on Lombard Street, where by pre-arrangement, they met with representatives of the 3 other British banks, and Levy had a chance for a reunion with his Kleinwort, Benson friends. The circumstances of the reunion were obviously less than happy, but Levy says that his friends took a realistic view of their situation and, with heroic objectivity, actually helped their fellow Britons to see the American side of the question. Nevertheless, this meeting, like the earlier one, broke up without commitment by anyone. Levy and his colleagues stayed at the Chase for lunch and then walked over to the Bank of England, which was interested in the Haupt loans to the extent that their default would affect Britain's balance of payment. The Bank of England, through one of its deputies, assured the visitors of its distress over both America's national tragedy and Wall Street's parochial one, and advised them that while it lacked the power to tell the London banks what to do, in its judgment they would be wise to go along with them. American scheme. Then, at about 2 o'clock, the trio returned to Lombard Street to wait nervously for word from the banks. As it happened, a parallel vigil was then beginning on Wall Street, where it was 9 o'clock on Monday morning, and where Funston, just arrived in his office and very much aware that only one day remained in which to get the deal wrapped up, was pacing his rug as he waited for a call that would tell him whether London was going to cause the pot to fall in. Kleinwort, Benson, and S. Jaffe Company were the first to agree to go along, Levy recalls. Then, after a silence of perhaps half an hour during which Levy and his colleagues began to have an agonizing sense of the minutes ticking away in New York, an affirmative answer came from Brandt. That was the big one. With the chief creditor and 2 of the 3 others in line, it was all but certain that Ansbachir would join up. At around 4 p.m. London time, Ansbachir did, and Levy was finally able to place the call that Funston had been waiting for. Their mission accomplished, the Americans went straight to the London airport and within 3 hours were on a plane headed home. On getting the good news, Funston felt that the whole agreement was pretty well in the bag at last, since all that was needed to seal the bag was the signatures of the 15 Haupt general partners, who seemed to have nothing to lose and everything to gain from the plan. Still, the task of getting those signatures was a vital one. Short of a bankruptcy suite, which everyone was trying to avoid, no liquidator could distribute the Haupt assets, not even the marble-topped cabinets and refrigerators, without the partners' permission. Accordingly, late on Monday afternoon, the Haupt partners, each accompanied by his lawyer, trooped into Chairman Watts's office at the stock exchange to learn exactly what fate the Wall Street powers had been arranging for them. The Haupt partners could hardly have found the projected agreement pleasant reading, inasmuch as it prescribed, among other things, that they were to execute powers of attorney giving a liquidator full control over Haupt's affair. However, one of their own lawyers gave them a short, pungent talk pointing out that they were personally liable for the firm's debts, whether or not they signed the agreement, so they might as well be public-spirited and sign it. More briefly, they were over a barrel. Many of them later filed personal bankruptcy papers. One startling event broke the even tenor of this gloomy meeting. Shortly after the Haupt lawyer had wound up his disquisition on the facts of life, someone noticed an unfamiliar and strikingly youthful face in the crowd and asked its owner to identify himself. The unhesitating reply was, "I'm Russell Watson, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal." There was a short, stunned silence in recognition of the fact that an untimely leak might still disturb the delicate balance of money and emotion that made up the agreement. Watson himself, who was 24 and had been on the Journal for a year, has since explained how he got into the meeting and under what circumstances he left it. "I was new on the stock exchange beat then," he said afterward. Earlier in the day, there had been word that Funston would probably hold a press conference sometime that evening. So I went over to the exchange. At the main entrance, I asked a guard where Mr. Funston's conference was. The guard said it was on the 6th floor and ushered me into an elevator. I suppose he thought I was a banker, a Haupt partner, or a lawyer. On the 6th floor, people were milling around everywhere. I just walked off the elevator and into the office where the meeting was. Nobody stopped me. I didn't understand much of what was going on. I got the feeling that whatever was at stake, there was general agreement, but still a lot of haggling over details to be done. I didn't recognize anybody there but Funston. I stood around quietly for about 5 minutes before anybody noticed me, and then everybody said, pretty much at once, "Good God, get out of here." So they didn't exactly kick me out, but I saw it was time to go. During the haggling phase that followed, a painfully protracted one, it developed. The Haupt partners and their lawyers made a command post of Watts's office, while the bank representatives and their lawyers camped in the north committee room just down the hall. Funston, who was determined that the news of a settlement should be in the hands of investors before the opening of the market next morning, was going wild with irritation and frustration, and in an effort to speed things up, he constituted himself a sort of combination messenger boy and voice. All Monday evening, I kept running back and forth saying, "Look, they won't give in on this point, so you've got to," he recalls. Or I'd say, "Look what time it is." Look what time it is, until tomorrow's market opening, initial here." At 15 minutes past midnight, 9 3/4 hours before the market's reopening, the agreement was signed in the South Committee room by the 28 parties at interest, in an atmosphere that a participant has described as one of exhaustion and general relief. As soon as the banks opened on Tuesday morning, the stock exchange deposited $7.5 million, a sum amounting to roughly 1/3 of its available reserve, in an account on which the Haupt liquidator could draw. The same morning, the liquidator himself, James Mahoney, a veteran member of the exchange's staff, moved into the Haupt offices to take charge. The stock market, encouraged by confidence in the new president or by news of the Haupt settlement or by a combination of the two, had its greatest one-day rise in history, more than eliminating Friday's losses. A week later, on December 2nd, Mahoney announced that $1,750,000 had already been paid out of the stock exchange account to bail out Haupt customers. By December 12th, the figure was up to $5,400,000, and by Christmas to $6,700,000. Finally, on March 11, 1964, the exchange was able to report that it had dispensed $9.5 million, and that the Haupt customers, with the exception of a handful who couldn't be found, were whole again. The agreement, in which some people saw an unmistakable implication that Wall Street's establishment now felt accountable for public harm caused by the misdeeds, or even the misfortunes, of any of its members, gave rise to a variety of reactions. The rescued Haupt customers were predictably grateful, of course. The Times said that the agreement was evidence of a sense of responsibility that served to inspire investor confidence and may have helped to avoid a potential panic. In Washington, President Johnson interrupted his first business day in office to telephone Funston and congratulate him. The chairman of the SEC, William L. Carey, who was not ordinarily given to throwing bouquets at the stock exchange, said in December that it had furnished a dramatic, impressive demonstration of its strength and concern for the public interest. Other stock exchanges around the world were silent on the matter, but if one may judge by the unsentimental way that most of them do business, some of their officials must have been indulging in a certain amount of head-shaking over the strange doings in New York. The stock exchange's member firms, who were assessed for the $9.5 million over a period of 3 years, appeared to be generally satisfied, although a few of them were heard to grumble that fine old firms with justified reputations for skill and probity should not be asked to pay the losses of greedy upstarts who overstep and get caught out. Oddly, almost no one seems to have expressed gratitude to the British and American banks, which recouped something like half of their losses. It may be that people simply don't thank banks, except in television commercials. The stock exchange itself, meanwhile, was torn between blushingly accepting congratulations and prudently, if perhaps gracelessly, insisting that what it had done wasn't to be regarded as a precedent, that it wouldn't necessarily do the same thing again. Nor were the exchange's officials at all sure that the same thing would have been done if the Hop case had occurred earlier, even a very little earlier. Crooks, who was chairman of the exchange in the early 1950s, felt that the chances of such action during his term would have been about 50-50. Funston, who assumed his office in 1951, felt that the matter would have been questionable during the early years of his incumbency. One's idea of public responsibility is evolutionary, he said. He was particularly annoyed by the idea, which he had heard repeatedly, that the exchange had acted out of a sense of guilt. Psychoanalytic interpretations of the event, he felt, were gratuitous, not to say churlish. As for those older governors who glared, quite possibly balefully, at the negotiations from their gilt frames in the governor's room and the North and South Committee rooms, their reaction to the whole proceeding may be imagined, but cannot be known. Chapter 7. The Impacted Philosophers. Among the greatest problems facing American industry today, one may learn by talking with any of a large number of industrialists who are not known to be especially given to pontificating, is the problem of communication. This preoccupation with the difficulty of getting a thought out of one head and into another is something the industrialists share with a substantial number of intellectuals and creative writers, more and more of whom seem inclined to regard communication, or the lack of it, as one of the greatest problems not just of industry but of humanity. A group of avant-garde writers and artists have given the importance of communication a backhanded boost by flatly and unequivocally proclaiming themselves to be against it. As far as the industrialists are concerned, I admit that in the course of hearing them invoke the word communication, often in an almost mystical way, over a period of years I have had a lot of trouble figuring out exactly what they meant. The general thesis is clear enough, namely, that everything would be all right first if they could get through to each other within their own organizations, and second, if they or their organizations could get through to everybody else. What has puzzled me is how and why, in this day when the foundations sponsor one study of communication after another, individuals and organizations fail so consistently to express themselves understandably, or how and why their listeners fail to grasp what they hear. A few years ago, I acquired a 2-volume publication of the United States Government Printing Office entitled Hearings Before the Subcommittee on Antitrust and Monopoly of the Committee on the Judiciary, United States Senate, 87th Congress, First Session, pursuant to C. Rees. 52, and after a fairly diligent perusal of its 1459 pages, I thought I could begin to see what the industrialists are talking about. The hearings, conducted in April, May, and June 1961 under the chairmanship of Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, had to do with the now famous price fixing and bid rigging conspiracies in the electrical manufacturing industry, which had already resulted the previous February imposition by a federal judge in Philadelphia of fines totaling $1,924,500 on 29 firms and 45 of their employees, and also of 30-day prison sentences on 7 of the employees. Since there had been no public presentation of evidence, all the defendants having pleaded either guilty or no defense, and since the records of the grand juries that indicted them were secret, the public had had little opportunity to hear about the details of the violations, and Senator Kefauver felt that the whole matter needed a good airing. The transcript shows that it got one, and what the airing revealed, at least within the biggest company involved, was a breakdown in intramural communication so drastic as to make the building of the Tower of Babel seem a triumph of organizational rapport. In a series of indictments brought by the government in the United States District Court in Philadelphia between February and October 1960, the 29 companies and their executives were charged with having repeatedly violated Section 1 of the Sherman Act of 1890, which declares illegal every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy, in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations. The Sherman Act was the instrument used in the celebrated trust busting activities of Theodore Roosevelt, and along with the Clayton Act of 1914, it has served as the government's weapon against cartels and monopolies ever since. The violations, the government alleged, were committed in connection with the sale of large and expensive pieces of apparatus, of a variety that is required chiefly by public and private electric utility companies, power transformers, switchgear assemblies, and turbine generator units, among many others, and were the outcome of a series of meetings attended by executives of the supposedly competing companies, beginning at least as early as 1956 and continuing into 1959, at which non-competitive price levels were agreed upon, nominally sealed bids on individual contracts were rigged in advance, and each company was allocated a certain percentage of the available business. The government further alleged that, in an effort to preserve the secrecy of these meetings, the executives had resorted to such devices as referring to their companies by code numbers in their correspondence, making telephone calls from public booths or from their homes rather than from their homes rather than from their homes rather than from their offices, and doctoring the expense accounts covering their get-togethers to conceal the fact that they had all been in a certain city on a certain day. But their stratagems did not prevail. The Federals, forcefully led by Robert A. Bix, then head of the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, succeeded in exposing them, with considerable help from some of the conspirators themselves, who, after an employee of a small conspirator company saw fit to spill the story in the early fall of 1959, flocked to turn state's evidence. The economic and social significance of the whole affair may be demonstrated clearly enough by citing just a few figures. In an average year at the time of the conspiracies, a total of more than $1.75 billion was spent to purchase machines of the sort in question, nearly a fourth of it by federal, state, and local governments, which, of course, means the taxpayers, and most of the rest buyers, and most of the rest by private utility companies, which are inclined to pass along any rise in the cost of their equipment to the public in the form of rate increases. To take a specific example of the kind of money involved in an individual transaction, the list price of a 500,000 kilowatt turbine generator, a monstrous device for producing electric power from steam power, was often something like $16 million. Actually, manufacturers sometimes cut their prices by as much as 25% in order to make a sale, and therefore, if everything was above board, it might have been possible to buy the machine at a saving of $4 million. If representatives of the companies making such generators held a single meeting and agreed to fix prices, they could, in effect, increase the cost to the customer by the $4 million. And in the end, the customer was almost sure to be the public. In presenting the indictments in Philadelphia, Bix stated that, considered collectively, they revealed a pattern of violations which can fairly be said to range among the most serious, the most flagrant, the most pervasive that have ever marked any basic American industry. Just before imposing the sentences, Judge J. Cullen Gainey went even further. In his view, the violations constituted a shocking indictment of a vast section of our economy. For what is really at stake here is the survival of the E3 enterprise system. The prison sentences showed that he meant it. Although there had been many successful prosecutions for violation of the Sherman Act during the 7 decades since its passage, it was rare indeed for executives to be jailed. Not surprisingly, therefore, the case kicked up quite a ruckus in the press. The New Republic, to be sure, complained that the newspapers and magazines were intentionally playing down the biggest business scandal in decades, but the charge did not seem to have much foundation. Considering such things as the public's apathy toward switchgear, the woeful bloodlessness of criminal cases involving antitrust laws, and the relatively few details of the conspiracies that had emerged, the press in general gave the story a good deal of space, and even the Wall Street Journal and Fortune ran uncompromising and highly informative accounts of the debacle. Here and there, in fact, one could detect signs of a revival of the spirit of old-time anti-business journalism as it existed back in the 30s. After all, what could be more exhilarating than to see several dignified, impeccably tailored, and highly paid executives of a few of the nation's most respected corporations being trooped off to jail like common pickpockets? It was certainly the biggest moment for business. Bader's since 1938, when Richard Whitney, the former president of the New York Stock Exchange, was put behind bars for speculating with his customers' money. Some called it the biggest since Teapot Dome. To top it all off, there was a prevalent suspicion of hypocrisy in the very highest places. Neither the chairman of the board nor the president of General Electric, the largest of the corporate defendants, had been caught in the government's dragnet. And the same was true of Westinghouse Electric, the second largest. These four ultimate bosses let it be known that they had been entirely ignorant of what had been going on within their commands right up to the time the first testimony on the subject was given to the Justice Department. Many people, however, were not satisfied by these disclaimers, and instead took the position that the defendant executives were men in the middle who had broken the law only in response either to actual orders or to a corporate climate favoring price fixing, and who were now being allowed to suffer for the sins of their superiors. Among the unsatisfied was Judge Gainey himself, who said at the time of the sentencing, one would be most naive indeed to believe that these violations of the law so long persisted in, affecting so large a segment of the industry, and finally involving so many millions upon millions of dollars, were facts unknown to those responsible for the conduct of the corporation. I am convinced that in the great number of these defendants' cases, they were torn between conscience and approved corporate policy, with the rewarding objectives of promotion, comfortable security, and large salary. The public naturally wanted a ringleader, an arch-conspirator, and it appeared to find what it wanted in General Electric, which, to the acute consternation of the men endeavoring to guide its destinies from company headquarters at 570 Lexington Avenue, New York City, got the lion's share of attention both in the press and in the subcommittee hearings. With some 300,000 employees and sales averaging some $4 billion a year over the past 10 years, it was not only far and away the biggest of the 29 accused companies, but judged on the basis of sales in 1959, the fifth biggest company in the country. It also drew a higher total of fines, $437,500, than any other company, and saw more of its executives sent to jail, 3, with 8 others receiving suspended sentences. Furthermore, as if to intensify in this hour of crisis the horror and shock of true believers and the glee of scoffers, its highest-ranking executives had for years tried to represent it to the public as a paragon of successful virtue by issuing encomiums to the free competitive system, the very system that the price-fixing meetings were set up to mock. In 1959, shortly after the government's investigation of the violations had been brought to the attention of GEA's policymakers, the company demoted and cut the pay of those of its executives who admitted that they had been involved. One vice president, for example, was informed that instead of the $127,000 a year he had been getting, he would now get $40,000. He had scarcely adjusted himself to that blow when Judge Gainey fined him $4,000 and sent him to prison for 30 days, and shortly after he regained his freedom, General Electric eased him out entirely. The GA policy of imposing penalties of its own on these employees, regardless of what punishment the court might prescribe, was not adopted by Westinghouse, which waited until the judge had disposed of the case and then decided that the fines and prison sentences he had handed out to its stable offenders were chastisement enough and did not itself penalize them at all. Some people saw this attitude as evidence that Westinghouse was condoning the conspiracies, but others regarded it as a commendable, if tacit, admission that management at the highest level in the conniving companies was responsible, morally at least, for the whole mess and was therefore in no position to discipline its erring employees. In the view of these people, GE's haste to penalize the acknowledged culprits on its payroll strongly suggested that the firm was trying to save its own skin by throwing a few luckless employees to the wolves, or, Senator Philip Alipp, Hart of Michigan, put it more pungently during the hearings, to do a Pontius Pilate operation, embattled days at 570 Lexington Avenue. After years of cloaking the company in the mantle of a wise and benevolent corporate institution, the public relations people at GE Headquarters were faced with the ugly choice of representing its role in the price-fixing affair as that of either a fool or a knave. They tended strongly toward fool. Judge Gainey, by his statement that he assumed the conspiracies to have been not only condoned, but approved by the top brass and the company as a whole, clearly chose Nate. But his analysis may or may not have been the right one. And after reading the Kefauver subcommittee testimony, I have come to the melancholy conclusion that the truth will very likely never be known. For, as the testimony shows, the clear waters of moral responsibility at GE became hopelessly muddied by a struggle to communicate. A struggle so confused that in some cases it would appear if one of the big bosses at GE had ordered a subordinate to break the law, the message would somehow have been garbled in its reception. And if the subordinate had informed the boss that he was holding conspiratorial meetings with competitors, the boss might well have been under the impression that the subordinate was gossiping idly about lawn parties or pinochle sessions. Specifically, it would appear that a subordinate who received a direct oral order from his boss had to figure out whether it meant what it seemed to or the exact opposite, while the boss, in conversing with a subordinate, had to figure out whether he should take what the man told him at face value or should attempt to translate it out of a secret code to which he was by no means sure he had the key. That was the problem in a nutshell, and I state it here thus baldly as a suggestion for any potential beneficiary of a foundation who may be casting about for a suitable project on which to draw up a prospectus. For the past 8 years or so, GE had a company rule called Directive Policy 20.5, which read, in part, no employee shall enter into any understanding, agreement, plan, or scheme, expressed or implied, formal or informal, with any competitor in regard to prices, terms, or conditions of sale, production, distribution, territories, or customers, nor exchange or discuss with a competitor prices, terms, or conditions of sale, or any other competitive information. In effect, this rule was simply an injunction to GEA's personnel to obey the federal antitrust laws, except that it was somewhat more concrete and comprehensive in the matter of price than they are. It was almost impossible for executives with jurisdiction over pricing policies at GE to be unaware of 20.5 or even hazy about it, because to make sure that new executives were acquainted with it and to refresh the memories of old ones, the company formally reissued and distributed it at intervals, and all such executives were asked to sign their names to it as an earnest that they were currently complying with it and intended to keep on doing so. The trouble, at least during the period covered by the court action, and apparently for a long time before that as well, was that some people at GE, including some of those who regularly signed 20.5, simply did not believe that it was to be taken seriously. They assumed that 20.5 was mere window dressing, that it was on the books solely to provide legal protection for the company and for the higher-ups, that meeting illegally with competitors was recognized and accepted as standard practice within the company, and that often when a ranking executive ordered a subordinate executive to comply with 20.5, he was actually ordering him to violate it. Illogical as it might seem, this last assumption becomes comprehensible in the light of the fact that, for a time, when some executives orally conveyed or reconveyed the order, they were apparently in the habit of accompanying it with an unmistakable wink. In May of 1948, for example, there was a meeting of GE sales managers during which the custom of winking was openly discussed. Robert Paxton, an upper-level GE executive who later became the company's president, addressed the meeting and delivered the usual admonition about antitrust violations, whereupon William S. Ginn, then a sales executive in the transformer division under Paxton's authority, startled him by saying, "I didn't see you wink." Paxton replied firmly, "There was no wink. We mean it, and these are the orders." Asked by Senator Kefauver how long he had been aware that orders issued at GE were sometimes accompanied by winks, Paxton replied that he had first observed the practice way back in 1935, when his boss had given him an instruction along with a wink or its equivalent, and that when some time later the significance of the gesture dawned on him, he had become so incensed that he had with difficulty restrained himself from jeopardizing his career by punching the boss in the nose. Paxton went on to say that his objections to the practice of winking had been so strong as to earn him a reputation in the company for being an anti-wink man, and that he, for his part, had never winked. Although Paxton would seem to have left little doubt as to how he intended his winkless order of 1948 to be interpreted, its meaning failed to get through to Ginn for not long after it was issued. He went out and fixed prices to a fair that. Obviously, it takes more than one company to make a price fixing agreement, but all the testimony tends to indicate that it was GEA. That generally set the pattern for the rest of the industry in such matters. 13 years later, Jin, fresh from a few weeks in jail and fresh out of a $135,000 year job, appeared before the subcommittee to account for, among other things, his strange response to the winkless order. He had disregarded it, he said, because he had received a contrary order from two of his other superiors in the GEDA chain of command, Henry V.B. Urban and Francis Fairman, and in explaining why he had heeded their order rather than Paxton's, he introduced the fascinating concept of degrees of communication, other theme for a Foundation grantee to get his teeth into. Urban and Fairman, Jin said, had been more articulate, persuasive, and forceful in issuing their order than Paxton had been in issuing his. Fairman, especially, Jin stressed, had proved to be a great communicator, a great philosopher, and frankly, a great believer in stability of prices. Both Urban and Fairman had dismissed Paxton as naive, Jin testified, and in further summary of how he had been led astray, he said that the people who were advocating the devil were able to sell me better than the philosophers that were selling the Lord. It would be helpful to have at hand a report from Urban and Fairman themselves on the communication technique that enabled them to prevail over Paxton. But unfortunately, neither of these philosophers could testify before the subcommittee, because by the time of the hearings, both of them were dead. Paxton, who was available, was described in Jin's testimony as having been at all times one of the philosopher salesmen on the side of the Lord. I can clarify Mr. Paxton by saying Mr. Paxton came closer to being an Adam Smith advocate than any businessman I have met in America, Jin declared. Still, in 1950, when Jin admitted to Paxton in casual conversation that he had compromised himself in respect to antitrust matters, Paxton merely told him that he was a damn fool, and did not report the confession to anyone else in the company. Testifying as to why he did not, Paxton said that when the conversation occurred, he was no longer Ginnon's boss, and that, in the light of his personal ethics, repeating such an admission by a man not under his authority would be gossip and tale-bearing. Meanwhile, Jin, no longer answerable to Paxton, was meeting with competitors at frequent intervals and moving steadily up the corporate ladder. In November 1954, he was made general manager of the Transformer Division, whose headquarters were in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, a job that put him in line for a vice presidency. At the time of Jin's shift, Ralph G.I. Cordner, who has been chairman of the board of General Electric since 1949, called him down to New York for the express purpose of enjoining him to comply strictly and undeviatingly with Directive Policy 20. 5. Cordner communicated this idea so successfully that it was clear enough to Jin at the moment, but it remained so only as long as it took him after leaving the chairman to walk to Urban's office. There, his comprehension of what he had just heard became clouded. Urban, who was head of GEA's distribution group, ranked directly below Cordner and directly above Jin. And according to Jin's testimony, no sooner were they alone in his office than he countermanded Cordner's injunction, saying, "Now keep on doing the way that you have been doing, but just be sensible about it and use your head on the subject." Urban's extraordinary communicative prowess again carried the day, and Jin continued to meet with competitors. "I knew Mr. Cordner could fire me," he told Senator Kefauver, "but also I knew I was working for Mr. Urban." At the end of 1954, Paxton took over Urban's job and thereby became Jin's boss again. Jin went right on meeting with competitors, but since he was aware that Paxton disapproved of the practice, didn't tell him about it. Moreover, he testified within a month or two he had become convinced that he could not afford to discontinue attending the meetings under any circumstances. For in January 1955, the entire electrical equipment industry became embroiled in a drastic price war, known as the White Sale, because of its timing and the bargains it afforded to buyers, in which the erstwhile amiable competitors began fiercely undercutting one another. Such a manifestation of free enterprise was, of course, exactly what the intercompany conspiracies were intended to prevent. But just at that time, the supply of electrical apparatus so greatly exceeded the demand that first a few of the conspirators and then more and more began breaking them. Agreements they themselves had made, in dealing with the situation as best he could. Jin said, "He used the philosophies that had been taught me previously, by which he meant that he continued to conduct price fixing meetings in the hope that at least some of the agreements made at them would be honored." As for Paxton, in Jin's opinion, that philosopher was not only ignorant of the meetings, but so constant in his devotion to the concept of free and aggressive competition that he actually enjoyed the price war, disastrous though it was to everybody's profit. In his own testimony, Paxton vigorously denied that he had enjoyed it. Within a year or so, the electrical equipment industry took an upturn, and in January 1957, Ginn, having ridden out the storm relatively well, got his vice presidency. At the same time, he was transferred to Schenectady to become general manager of GE's turbine generator division, and Cordner again called him into headquarters and gave him a lecture on 20.5. Such lectures were getting to be a routine with Cordner. Every time a new employee was assigned to a strategic managerial post or an old employee was promoted to such a post, the lucky fellow could be reasonably certain that he would be summoned to the chairman's office to hear a rendition of the austere creed. In his book, The Heart of Japan, Alexander Campbell reports that a large Japanese electrical concern has drawn up a list of 7 company commandments, for example, be courteous and sincere, and that each morning in each of its 30 factories, the workers are required to stand at attention and recite these in unison and then to sing the company song forever. Increasing production, love your work, give your all. Cordner did not require his subordinates to recite or sing 20.5. As far as is known, he never even had it set to music. But from the number of times men like Ginn had it read to them or otherwise recalled to their attention, they must have come to know it well enough to chant it, improvising a tune as they went along. This time, Cordner's message not only made an impression on Ginn's mind, but stuck there in unadulterated form. Ginn, according to his testimony, became a reformed executive and dropped his price-fixing habits overnight. However, it appears that his sudden conversion cannot be attributed wholly to Cordner's powers of communication, or even to the drip effect of repetition, for it was to a considerable extent pragmatic in character, like the conversion of Henry VIII to Protestantism. He reformed, Ginn explained to the subcommittee, because his air cover was gone. What was gone? Senator Kefauver asked. My air cover was gone, replied Ginn. I had lost my air cover. Mr. Urban wasn't around anymore, and all of my colleagues had gone, and I was now working directly for Mr. Paxton, knowing his feelings on the matter. Any philosophy that I had grown up with before in the past was now out the window. If Urban, who had not been Ginn's boss since late in 1954, had been the source of his air cover, Ginn must have been without its protection for over 2 years, but presumably, in the excitement of the price war, he had failed to notice its absence. However that may have been, here he now was, a man suddenly shorn not only of his air cover, but of his philosophy. Swiftly filling the latter void with a whole new set of principles, he circulated copies of 20.5 among his department managers in the turbine generator division and topped this off by energetically adopting what he called a leprosy policy. That is, he advised his subordinates to avoid even casual social contacts with their counterparts in competing companies, because once the relationships are established, I have come to the conclusion after many years of hard experience that the relationships tend to spread and the hanky-panky begins to get going. But now, fate played a cruel trick on Ginn, and, all unknowing, he landed in the very position that Paxton and Cordner had been in for years, that of a philosopher vainly endeavoring to sell the Lord to a flock that declined to buy his message and was, in fact, systematically engaging in the hanky its leader had warned it against. Specifically, during the whole of 1957 and 1958 and the first part of 1959, 2 of Ginn's subordinates were piously signing 20.5 with one hand and with the other, briskly drawing up price, fixing agreements at a whole series of meetings in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Hot Springs, Virginia, Skytop, Pennsylvania, to name a few of their gathering places. It appears that Ginn had not been able to impart much of his shining new philosophy to others, and that at the root of his difficulty lay that old jinx, the problem of communicating. Asked at the hearings how his subordinates could possibly have gone so far astray, he replied, I have got to admit that I made a communication error. I didn't sell this thing to the boys well enough. The price is so important in the complete running of a business that, philosophically, we have got to sell people not only just the fact that it is against the law, but that it shouldn't be done for many, many reasons. But it has got to be a philosophical approach and a communication approach. Even though I had told my associates not to do this, some of the boys did get off the reservation. I have to admit to myself here an area of a failure in communications. which I am perfectly willing to accept my part of the responsibility for. In earnestly striving to analyze the cause of the failure, Jin said, he had reached the conclusion that merely issuing directives, no matter how frequently, was not enough. What was needed was a complete philosophy, a complete understanding, a complete breakdown of barriers between people. If we are going to get some understanding and really live and manage these companies within the philosophies that they should be managed in. Senator Hart permitted himself to comment, "You can communicate until you are dead and gone. But if the point you're communicating about, even though it be a law of the land, strikes your audience as something that is just a folklore, you will never sell the package." Jin ruefully conceded that that was true. The concept of degrees of communication was further developed, by implication, in the testimony of another defendant, Frankie E. Stellike, who had been general manager of the Low Voltage Switchgear Department from May 1956 to February 1960. As all but a tiny minority of the users of electricity are contentedly unaware, switchgear serves to control and protect apparatus used in the generation, conversion, transmission, and distribution of electrical energy, and more than $100 million worth of it is sold annually in the United States. Stellike received some of his business guidance in the conventional form of orders, oral and written, and some, perhaps just as much, to judge by his testimony, through a less intellectual, more visceral medium of communication that he called impact. Apparently, when something happened within the company that made an impression on him, he would consult a sort of internal metaphysical voltmeter to ascertain the force of the jolt that he had received, and from the reading he got, would attempt to gauge the true drift of company policy. For example, he testified that during 1956, 1957, and most of 1958, he believed that GEE was frankly and fully in favor of complying with 20.5. But then, in the autumn of 1958, George E. Burens, Stellik's immediate superior, told him that he, Burens, had been directed by Paxton, who by then was president of GE, to have lunch with Max Scott, president of the IITE Circuit Breaker Company, an important competitor in the switchgear market. Paxton said in his own testimony that while he had indeed asked Burens to have lunch with Scott, he had instructed him categorically not to talk about prices, but apparently Burens did not mention this caveat to Stellike. In any event, the disclosure that the high command had told Burens to lunch with an arch-rival, Stellike testified, had a heavy impact on me. Asked to amplify this, he said, "There are a great many impacts that influence me in my thinking as to the true attitude of the company, and that was one of them." As the impacts, great and small, piled up, their cumulative effect finally communicated to Stellike that he had been wrong in supposing the company had any real respect for 20.5. Accordingly, when, late in 1958, Stellike was ordered by Burens to begin holding price meetings with the competitors, he was not in the least surprised. Stellike's compliance with Burens' order ultimately brought on a whole new series of impacts, of a much more crudely communicative sort. In February 1960, General Electric cut his annual pay from $70,000 to $26,000 for violating 20.5. A year later, Judge Gainey gave him a $3,000 fine and a suspended 30-day jail sentence for violating the Sherman Act, and about a month after that asked for and got his resignation. Indeed, during his last years with the firm, Stellike seems to have received almost as many lacerating impacts as a Raymond Chandler hero, but testimony given at the hearings by L.L. Gizon, manager of the marketing section of the low-voltage switchgear department, indicated that Stellike, again like a Chandler hero, was capable of dishing out blunt impacts as well as taking them. Gizon, who was directly under Stellike in the line of command, told the subcommittee that although he had taken part in fixing meetings prior to April 1956 when Stellike became his boss, he did not subsequently engage in any antitrust violations until late 1958, and that he did so then only as the result of an impact that bore none of the subtlety noted by Stellike in his early experience with this phenomenon. The impact came directly from Stellike, who, it seems, left nothing to chance in communicating with his subordinates. In Gizon's words, Stellike told him to resume the meetings, that the company policy was unchanged. The risk was just as great as it ever had been, and that if our activities were discovered, I personally would be dismissed or disciplined by the company, as well as punished by the government. So Gizon was left with three choices: to quit, to disobey the direct order of his superior, in which case he thought they might have found somebody else to do my job, or to obey the order, and thereby violate the antitrust laws with no immunity against the possible consequences. In short, his alternatives were comparable to those faced by an international spy. Although Jason did resume the meetings, he was not indicted, possibly because he had been a relatively minor price fixer. General Electric, for its part, demoted him, but did not require him to resign. Yet it would be a mistake to assume that Jason was relatively untouched by his experience. Asked by Senator Kefauver if he did not think that Stalich's order had placed him in an intolerable position, he replied that it had not struck him that way at the time. Asked whether he thought it unjust that he had suffered demotion for carrying out the order of a superior, he replied, "I personally don't consider it so." To judge by his answers, the impact on Jason's heart and mind would seem to have been heavy indeed. The other side of the communication problem, the difficulty that a superior is likely to encounter in understanding what a subordinate tells him, is graphically illustrated by the testimony of Raymond W. Smith, who was general manager of GEI's Transformer Division from the beginning of 1957 until late in 1959, and of Arthur F. Vinson, who in October 1957 was appointed vice president in charge of GE's apparatus group and also a member of the company's executive committee. Smith's job was the one Jen had held for the previous 2 years, and when Vinson got his job, he became Smith's immediate boss. Smith's highest paid during the period in question was roughly $100,000 a year, while Vinson reached a basic salary of $110,000, and also got a variable bonus ranging from $45,000 to $100,000. Smith testified that on January 1, 1957, the very day he took charge of the Transformer Division, and a holiday at that, he met with Chairman Cordner and Executive Vice President Paxton, and Cordner gave him the familiar admonition about living up to 20.5. However, later that year, the competitive going got so rough that transformers were selling at discounts of as much as 35%, and Smith decided on his own hook that the time had come to begin negotiating with rival firms in the hope of stabilizing the market. He felt that he was justified in doing this, he said, because he was convinced that both in company circles and in the whole industry negotiations of this kind were the order of the day. By the time Vinson became his superior in October, Smith was regularly attending price-fixing meetings, and he felt that he ought to let his new boss know what he was doing. Accordingly, he told the subcommittee on 2 or 3 occasions when the two men found themselves alone together in the normal course of business. He said to Vinson, "I had a meeting with the Klan this morning." Counsel for the subcommittee asked Smith whether he had ever put the matter more bluntly, whether, for example, he had ever said anything like "we're meeting with competitors to fix prices. We're going to have a little conspiracy here and I don't want it to get out." Smith replied that he had never said anything remotely like that, had done nothing more than make remarks on the order of "I had a meeting with the Klan this morning." He did not elaborate on why he did not speak with greater directness, but 2 logical possibilities present themselves. Perhaps he hoped that he could keep Vinson informed about the situation and at the same time protect him from the risk of becoming an accomplice. Or perhaps he had no such intention and was simply expressing himself in the oblique, colloquial way that characterized much of his speaking. Paxton, a close friend of Smith's, had once complained to Smith that he was given to being somewhat cryptic in his remarks. Anyhow, Vinson, according to his own testimony, had flatly misunderstood what Smith meant. Indeed, he could not recall ever hearing Smith use the expression "meeting of the Klan," although he did recall his saying things like, "Well, I'm going to take this new plan on transformers and show it to the boys." Vinson testified that he had thought the boys meant the GE district salespeople and the company's customers, and that the new plan was a new marketing plan. He said that it had come as a rude shock to him to learn, a couple of years later after the case had broken, that in speaking of the boys and the new plan, Smith had been referring to competitors and a price-fixing scheme. "I think Mr. Smith is a sincere man," Vinson testified. "I'm sure Mr. Smith thought he was telling me that he was going to one of these meetings. This meant nothing to me." Smith, on the other hand, was confident that his meaning had got through to Vinson. "I never got the impression that he misunderstood me," he insisted to the subcommittee. Questioning Vinson later, Kefauver asked whether an executive in his position with 30-odd years' experience in the electrical industry could possibly be so naive as to misunderstand a subordinate on such a substantive matter as grasping who the boys were. "I don't think it is too naive," replied Vinson. We have a lot of boys. I may be naive, but I'm certainly telling the truth. And in this kind of thing, I'm sure I am naive. Senator Kefauver, Mr. Vinson, you wouldn't be a vice president at $200,000 a year if you were naive. Mr. Vinson, I think I could well get there by being naive in this area. It might help. Here, in a different field altogether, the communication problem again comes to the fore. Was Vinson really saying to Kefauver what he seemed to be saying? That naivete about antitrust violations might be a help to a man in getting and holding a $200,000 year job at General Electric? It seems unlikely, and yet what else could he have meant? Whatever the answer, neither the federal antitrust men nor the Senate investigators were able to prove that Smith succeeded in his attempts to communicate to Vinson the fact that he was engaging in price fixing. And, lacking such proof, they were unable to establish what they gave every appearance of going all out to establish if they could, namely, that at least some one man at the pinnacle of GE's management, some member of the sacred executive committee itself, was implicated. Actually, when the story of the conspiracies first became known, Vinson not only concurred in the company decision to punish Smith by drastically demoting him, but personally informed him of the decision. You acts that if he had grasped Smith's meaning back in 1950 CV would have denoted a remarkable degree of cynicism and hypocrisy. Smith, by the way, rather than accept the demotion, quit General Electric and, after being fined $3,000 and given a suspended 30-day prison sentence by Judge Ganay, found a job elsewhere at $10,000 a year. This was not Vinson's only brush with the case. He was also among those named in one of the grand jury indictments that precipitated the court action, this time in connection not with his comprehension of Smith's jargon, but with the conspiracy in the switchgear department. On this aspect of the case, 4 switchgear executives, Burens, Stielike, Clarence E., Burke, and H. Frank Henschel, testified before the grand jury and later before the subcommittee that at some time in July, August, or September of 1958, one of them could establish the precise date. Vinson had had lunch with them in dining room B of G, Switchgear Works in Philadelphia, and that during the meal he had instructed them to hold price meetings with competitors. As a result of this order, they said, a meeting attended by representatives of GE Westinghouse, the Alice Chalmers Manufacturing Company, the Federal Pacific Electric Company, and the IAT Circuit Breaker Company was held at the Hotel Traymore in Atlantic City on November 9, 1958, at which sales of switchgear to federal, state, and municipal agencies were divvied up, with General Electric to get 39% of the business, Westinghouse 35%, IT 11%, Alice Chalmers 8%, and Federal Pacific Electric 7%. At subsequent meetings, agreement was reached on allocating sales of switchgear to private buyers as well, and an elaborate formula was worked out whereby the privilege of submitting the lowest bid to prospective customers was rotated among the conspiring companies at 2-week intervals. Because of its periodic nature, this was called the phase of the moon formula, a designation that in due time led to the following lyrical exchange between the subcommittee and LWW. Long, an executive of Alice Chalmers, Senator Kefauver, who were the phasers of the mooners? Phase of the mooners. Mr. Long, as it developed, this so-called phase of the moon operation was carried out at a level below me, I think referred to as a working group. Mr. Farrell, counsel for the subcommittee. Did they ever report to you about it, Mr. Long? Phase of the moon. No. Vinson told the Justice Department prosecutors and repeated to the subcommittee that he had not known about the Traymore meeting, the phase of the mooners, or the existence of the conspiracy itself until the case broke. As for the lunch in dining room B, he insisted that it had never taken place. On this point, Burens, Stalick, Burke, and Henschel submitted to lie detector tests administered by the FBI and passed them. Vinson refused to take a lie detector test, at first explaining that he was acting on advice of counsel and against his personal inclination, and later, after hearing how the 4 other men had fared, arguing that if the machine had not pronounced them liars, it couldn't be any good. It was established that on only 8 business days during July, August, and September had Burens, Burke, Stalick, and Henschel all been together in the Philadelphia plant at the lunch hour, and Vinson produced some of his expense accounts, which he pointed out to the Justice Department showed that he had been elsewhere on each of those days. Confronted with this evidence, the Justice Department dropped its case against Vinson, and he stayed on as a vice president of General Electric. Nothing that the subcommittee elicited from him cast any substantive doubt on the defense that had impressed the government prosecutors. Thus, the uppermost echelon at GE came through unscathed. The record showed that participation in the conspiracy went fairly far down in the organization, but not all the way to the top. Kizan, everybody agreed, had followed orders from Stalick, and Stalick had followed orders from Burns. But that was the end of the trail, because although Burns said he had followed orders from Vinson, Vinson denied it and made the denial state. The government, at the end of its investigation, stated in court that it could not prove and did not claim that either Chairman Cordner or President Paxton had authorized or even known about the conspiracies, and thereby officially ruled out the possibility that they had resorted to at least a figurative wink. Later, Paxton and Cordner showed up in Washington to testify before the subcommittee, and its interrogators were similarly unable to establish that they had ever indulged in any variety of winking. After being described by Gen as General Electric's stubbornest and most dedicated advocate of free competition, Paxton explained to the subcommittee that his thinking on the subject had been influenced not directly by Adam Smith, but rather by way of a former GE boss he had worked under, the late Gerard Swope. Swope, Paxton testified, had always believed firmly that the ultimate goal of business was to produce more goods for more people at lower cost. "I bought that then, I buy it now," said Paxton. I think it is the most marvelous statement of economic philosophy that any industrialist has ever expressed. In the course of his testimony, Paxton had an explanation, philosophical or otherwise, of each of the several situations related to price fixing in which his name had earlier been mentioned. For instance, it had been brought out that in 1956 or 1957 a young man named Jerry Page, a minor employee in GE's switchgear division, had written directly to Cordner alleging that the switchgear divisions of GE and of several competitor companies were involved in a conspiracy in which information about prices was exchanged by means of a secret code based on different colors of letter paper. Cordner had turned the matter over to Paxton with orders that he get to the bottom of it, and Paxton had thereupon conducted an investigation that led him to conclude that the color code conspiracy was wholly a hallucination on the part of this boy. In arriving at that conclusion, Paxton had apparently been right, although it later came out that there had been a conspiracy in the switchgear division during 1956 and 1957. This, however, was a rather conventional one, based simply on price, fixing meetings rather than on anything so guy as a color code. Page could not be called to testify because of ill health. Paxton conceded that there had been some occasions when he must have been pretty damn dumb. Dumb or not, for his services as the company's president he was, of course, remunerated on a considerably grander scale than Vinson, receiving a basic annual salary of $125,000, plus annual incentive compensation of about $175,000, plus stock options designed to enable him to collect much more at low tax rates. As for Paxton's attitude toward company communications, he emerges as a pessimist on this score. Upon being asked at the hearings to comment on the Smith-Vinson conversations of 1957, he said that knowing Smith, he just could not cast the man in the role of a liar, and went on, "When I was younger, I used to play a good deal of bridge. We played about 50 rubbers of bridge, 4 of us, every winter, and I think we probably played some rather good bridge. If you gentlemen are bridge players, you know that there is a code of signals that is exchanged between partners as the game progresses. It is a stylized form of playing. Now, as I think about this, and I was particularly impressed when I read Smith's testimony when he talked about a meeting of the clan, or meeting of the boys, I begin to think that there must have been a stylized method of communication between these people who were dealing with competition. Now Smith could say, I told Vinson what I was doing, and Vinson wouldn't have the foggiest idea what was being told to him, and both men could testify under oath, one saying yes and the other man saying no, and both be telling the truth. They wouldn't be on the same wavelength. They wouldn't have the same meanings. I believe now that these men did think that they were telling the truth, but they weren't communicating between each other with understanding. Here, certainly, is the gloomiest possible analysis of the communications problem. Chairman Cordner's status, it appears from his testimony, was approximately that of the Boston Cabots in the celebrated jingle. His services to the company, for which he was recompensed in truly handsome style, with, for 1960, a salary of just over $280,000, plus contingent deferred income of about $120,000, plus stock options potentially worth hundreds of thousands more, were indubitably many and valuable. But they were performed on such an exalted level that, at least in antitrust matters, he does not seem to have been able to have any earthly communication at all. When he emphatically told the subcommittee that at no time had he had so much as an inkling of the network of conspiracies, it could be deduced that his was a case not of faulty communication, but of no communication. He did not speak to the subcommittee of philosophy or philosophers as Ginn and Paxton had done, but from his past record of ordering reissues of 20.5 and of peppering his speeches and public statements with praise of free enterprise, it seems clear that he was unphilosophy Zansley's savoir and one on the side of selling the Lord, since no evidence was adduced to suggest that he was given to winking in any form. Kefauver ran through a long list of antitrust violations of which General Electric had been accused over the past half-century, asking Cordner, who joined the company in 1922, how much he knew about each of them. Oshily, he replied that he had known about them only after the fact. In commenting on Ginn's testimony that Urban had countermanded Cordner's direct order in 1954, Cordner said that he had read it with great alarm and great wonderment, since Urban had always allocated to him an intense competitive spirit, rather than any disposition to be friendly with rival companies. Throughout his testimony, Cordner used the curious expression, be responsive to. If, for instance, Kefauver inadvertently asked the same question twice, Cordner would say, I was responsive to that a moment ago. Or if Kefauver interrupted him, as he often did, Cordner would ask politely, may I be responsive? This, too, offers a small lead for a foundation grantee who might want to look into the distinction between being responsive, a passive state, and answering, an act, and their relative effectiveness in the process of communication. Summing up his position on the case as a whole in reply to a question of Kefauver's about whether he thought that GE had incurred corporate disgrace, Cordner said, no, I am not going to be responsive and say that General Electric had corporate disgrace. I am going to say that we are deeply grieved and concerned. I am not proud of it. Chairman Cordner, then, had been able to fairly deafen his subordinate officers with lectures on compliance with the rules of the company and the laws of the country, but he had not been able to get all those officers to comply with either, and President Paxton could muse thoughtfully on how it was that two of his subordinates, who had given radically different accounts of a conversation between them, could be not liars but merely poor communicators. Philosophy seems to have reached a high point at GE, and communication a low one. If executives could just learn to understand one another, most of the witnesses said or implied, the problem of antitrust violations would be solved. But perhaps the problem is cultural as well as technical, and has something to do with a loss of personal identity that comes from working in a huge organization. The cartoonist Jules Feiffer, contemplating the communication problem in a non-industrial context, has said, actually, the breakdown is between the person and himself. If you're not able to communicate successfully between yourself and yourself and yourself, how are you supposed to make it with a stranger? Outside? Suppose, purely as a hypothesis, that the owner of a company who orders his subordinates to obey the antitrust laws has such poor communication with himself that he does not really know whether he wants the order to be complied with or not. If his order is disobeyed, the resulting price fixing may benefit his company's coffers. If it is obeyed, then he has done the right thing. In the first instance, he is not personally implicated in any wrongdoing, while in the second, he is positively involved in right-doing. What, after all, can he lose? It is perhaps reasonable to suppose that such an executive might communicate his uncertainty more forcefully than his order. Possibly yet another foundation grantee should have a look at the reverse of communication failure, where he might discover that messages the sender does not even realize he is sending sometimes turn out to have got across only too effectively. Meanwhile, in the first years after the subcommittee concluded its investigation, the defendant companies were by no means allowed to forget their transgressions. The law permits customers who can prove that they have paid artificially high prices as a result of antitrust violations to sue for damages. In most cases, triple damages. In suits running into many millions of dollars piled up so high that Chief Justice Warren had to set up a special panel of federal judges to plan how they should all be handled. Needless to say, Cordner was not allowed to forget about the matter either. Indeed, it would be surprising if he was allowed a chance to think about much else, for in addition to the sweets, he had to contend with active efforts, unsuccessful as it turned out, by a minority group of stockholders, to unseat him. Paxton retired as president in April 1961 because of ill health dating back at least to the previous January when he underwent a major operation. As for the executives who pleaded guilty and were fined or imprisoned, most of those who had been employed by companies other than GEE remained with them, either in their old jobs or in similar ones. Of those who had been employed by GE, none remained there. Some retired permanently from business, others settled for comparatively small jobs, and a few landed big ones. Most spectacularly Jin, who in June 1961 became president of Baldwin Lima, Hamilton, manufacturers of heavy machinery. And as for the future of price fixing in the electrical industry, it seems safe to say that what with the Justice Department, Judge Gainey, Senator Kefauver, and the triple damage suites, the impact on the philosophers who guide corporate policy was such that they and even their subordinates likely to try to hew scrupulously to the line for quite some time. Quite a different question, however, is whether they had made any headway in their ability to communicate. Chapter 8. The Last Great Corner. Between spring and midsummer 1958, the common stock of the ELL. Bruce Company, the nation's leading maker of hardwood floors, moved from a low of just under $17 a share to a high of $190 a share. This startling, even alarming rise was made in an ascending scale that was climaxed by a frantic crescendo in which the price went up $100 a share in a single day. Nothing of the sort had happened for a generation. Furthermore, and even more alarming, the rise did not seem to have the slightest bit of relation to any sudden hunger on the part of the American public for new hardwood floors, to the consternation of almost everyone concerned, conceivably including even some of the holders of Bruce stock. It seemed to be entirely the result of a technical stock market situation called a corner. With the exception of a general panic such as occurred in 1929, a corner is the most drastic and spectacular of all developments that can occur in the stock market, and more than once in the 19th and early 20th centuries, corners had threatened to wreck the national economy. The Bruce situation never threatened to do that. For one thing, the Bruce Company was so small in relation to the economy as a whole that even the wildest gyrations in its stock could hardly have much national effect. For another, the Bruce corner was accidental, the byproduct of a fight for corporate control, rather than the result of calculated manipulations, as most of the historic corners had been. Finally, this one eventually turned out to be not a true corner at all, but only a near thing. In September, Bruce stock quieted down and settled at a reasonable level. But the incident served to stir up memories, some of them perhaps tinged with nostalgia, among those flinty old Wall Streeters who had been around to see the classic corners, or at least the last of them. In June of 1922, the New York Stock Exchange began listing the shares of a corporation called Piggly Wiggly Stores, a chain of retail self-service markets situated mostly in the South and West with headquarters in Memphis, and the stage was set for one of the most dramatic financial battles of that gaudy decade when Wall Street, only negligently watched over by the federal government, was frequently sent reeling by the machinations of operators seeking to enrich themselves and destroy their enemies. Among the theatrical aspects of this particular battle, a battle so celebrated in its time that headline writers referred to it simply as the Piggly Crisis, was the personality of the hero, or as some people saw it, the villain, who is a newcomer to Wall Street, a country boy setting out defiantly, amid the cheers of a good part of rural America, to lay the slick manipulators of New York by the heels. He was Clarence Saunders, of Memphis, a plump, neat, handsome man of 41, who was already something of a legend in his hometown, chiefly because of a house he was putting up there for himself, called the Pink Palace. It was an enormous structure faced with pink Georgia marble and built around an awe-inspiring white marble Roman atrium. And, according to Saunders, it would stand for 1,000 years. Unfinished though it was, the Pink Palace was like nothing Memphis had ever seen before. Its grounds were to include a private golf course, since Saunders liked to do his golfing in seclusion. Even the makeshift estate where he and his wife and 4 children were camping out, pending completion of the palace, had its own golf course. Some people said that his preference for privacy was induced by the attitude of the local country club governors, who complained that he had corrupted their entire supply of caddies by the grandeur of his tips. Saunders, who had founded the Piggly Wiggly stores in 1919, had most of the standard traits of the flamboyant American promoters: suspect generosity, a knack for attracting publicity, love of ostentation, and so on. But he also had some much less common traits, notably a remarkably vivid style, both in speech and writing, and a gift of which he may or may not have been aware, for comedy. But like so many great men before him, he had a weakness, a tragic flaw. It was that he insisted on thinking of himself as a hick, a boob, and a sucker, and in doing so, he sometimes became all three. This unlikely fellow was the man who engineered the last real corner in a nationally traded stock. The game of corner. For in its heyday, it was a game, a high-stakes gambling game, pure and simple, embodying a good many of the characteristics of poker. Was one phase of the endless Wall Street contest between bulls who want the price of a stock to go up and bears who want it to go down. When a game of corner was underway, the bull's basic method of operation was, of course, to buy stock, and the bear's was to sell it. Since the average bear didn't own any of the stock issue in contest, he would resort to the common practice of selling short. When a short sale is made, the transaction is consummated with stock that the seller has borrowed, at a suitable rate of interest, from a broker. Since brokers are merely agents and not outright owners, they in turn must borrow the stock themselves. This they do by tapping the floating supply of stock that is in constant circulation among investment houses. Stock that private investors have left with one house or another for trading purposes, stock that is owned by estates and trusts and has been released for action under certain prescribed conditions, and so on. In essence, the floating supply consists of all the stock in a particular corporation that is available for trading and is not immured in a safe deposit box or encased in a mattress. Though the supply floats, it is scrupulously kept track of. The short seller, borrowing, say, 1,000 shares from his broker, knows that he has incurred an immutable debt. What he hopes, the hope that keeps him alive, is that the market price of the stock will go down, enabling him to buy the 1,000 shares he owes at a bargain rate, pay off his debt, and pocket the difference. What he risks is that the lender, for one reason or another, may demand that he deliver up his 1,000 borrowed shares at a moment when their market price is at a high. Then the grinding truth of the old Wall Street jingle is borne in upon him. He who sells what isn't his'n must buy it back or go to prison. And in the days when corners were possible, the short seller's sleep was further disturbed by the fact that he was operating behind blank walls. Dealing only with agents, he never knew either the identity of the purchaser of his stock, a prospective cornerer, or the identity of the owner of the stock he had borrowed, the same prospective cornerer, attacking from the rear. Although it is sometimes condemned as being the tool of the speculator, short selling is still sanctioned in a severely restricted form on all of the nation's exchanges. In its unfettered state, it was the standard gambit in the game of corner. The situation would be set up when a group of bears would go on a well-organized spree of short selling and would often help their cause along by spreading rumors that the company back of the stock in question was on its last legs. This operation was called a bear raid, the bull's most formidable, but of course riskiest counter move was to try for a corner. Only a stock that many traders were selling short could be cornered. A stock that was in the throes of a real bear raid was ideal. In the latter situation, the would-be cornerer would attempt to buy up the investment house's floating supply of the stock and enough of the privately held shares to freeze out the bears. If the attempt succeeded when he called for the short sellers to make good the stock they had borrowed, they could buy it from no one but him, and they would have to buy it at any price he chose to ask. Their only alternatives, at least theoretically, being to go into bankruptcy or to jail for failure to meet their obligation. In the old days of titanic financial death struggles, when Adam Smith's ghost still smiled on Wall Street, corners were fairly common and were often extremely sanguinary, with hundreds of innocent bystanders, as well as the embattled principals, getting their financial heads lopped off. The most famous cornerer in history was that celebrated old pirate Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who engineered no less than 3 successful corners during the 1860s. Probably his classic job was in the stock of the Harlem Railway. By dint of secretly buying up all its available shares while simultaneously circulating a series of untruthful rumors of imminent bankruptcy to lure the short sellers in, he achieved an airtight trap. Finally, with the air of a man doing them a favor by saving them from jail, he offered the cornered shorts at $179 a share, the stock he had bought up at a small fraction of that figure. The most generally disastrous corner was that of 1901 in the stock of Northern Pacific. To raise the huge quantities of cash they needed to cover themselves, the Northern Pacific shorts sold so many other stocks as to cause a national panic with worldwide repercussion. The next to last great corner occurred in 1920 when Allen A. Ryan, a son of the legendary Thomas Fortune Ryan, in order to harass his enemies in the New York Stock Exchange, sought to corner the stock of the Stutz Motor Company, makers of the renowned Stutz Bearcat. Ryan achieved his corner and the stock exchange short sellers were duly squeezed. But Ryan, it turned out, had a Bearcat by the tail. The stock exchange suspended Stutz dealings, lengthy litigation followed, and Ryan came out of the affair financially ruined. Then, as at other times, the game of corner suffered from a difficulty that plagues other games: post-mortem disputes about the rules. The reform legislation of the 1930s, by outlawing any short selling that is specifically intended to demoralize a stock, as well as other manipulations leading toward corners, virtually ruled the game out of existence. Wall Streeters who speak of the corner these days are referring to the intersection of Broad and Wall. In U.S. stock markets, only an accidental corner or near corner like the Bruce one is now possible. Clarence Saunders was the last intentional player of the game. Saunders has been variously characterized by people who knew him well as a man of limitless imagination and energy, arrogant and conceited as all get out, essentially a 4-year-old child playing at things, and one of the most remarkable men of his generation. But there is no doubt that even many of the people who lost money on his promotional schemes believe that he was the soul of honesty. He was born in 1881 to a poor family in Amherst County, Virginia, and in his teens was employed by the local grocer at the pittance that is orthodox for future tycoons taking on their first jobs, in his case $4 a week. Moving ahead fast, he went on to a wholesale grocery company in Clarksville, Tennessee, and then to one in Memphis, and while still in his 20s, organized a small retail food chain called United Stores. He sold that after a few years, did a stint as a wholesale grocer on his own, and then, in 1919, began to build a chain of retail, self-service markets, to which he gave the engaging name of Piggly Wiggly Stores. When a Memphis business associate once asked him why he had chosen that name, he replied, "So people would ask me what you just did." The stores flourished so exuberantly that by the autumn of 1922, there were over 1,200 of them. Of these, some 650 were owned outright by Saunders Piggly Wiggly Stores, Inc. The rest were independently owned, but their owners paid royalties to the parent company for the right to adopt its patented method of operations. In 1923, an era when a grocery store meant clerks in white aprons and often a thumb on the scale, this method was described by the New York Times with astonishment. The customer in a Piggly Wiggly store rambles down aisle after aisle, on both sides of which are shelves. The customer collects his purchases and pays as he goes out. Although Saunders did not know it, he had invented the supermarket. A natural concomitant of the rapid rise of Piggly Wiggly stores in Shea was the acceptance of its shares for listing on the New York Stock Exchange, and within 6 months of that event, Piggly Wiggly stock had become known as a dependable, if unsensational, dividend payer, the kind of widows and orphan stock that speculators regard with the respectful indifference that crap shooters feel about bridge. This reputation, however, was short-lived. Several small companies that had been operating grocery stores in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut under the name Piggly Wiggly failed and went into receivership. These companies had scarcely any connection with Saunders' concern. He had merely sold them the right to use his firm's catchy trade name, leased them some patented equipment, and washed his hands of them. But when these independent Piggly Wigglies failed, a group of stock market operators, whose identities never were revealed because they dealt through tight-lipped brokers, saw in the situation a heaven-sent opportunity for a bear rake. If individual Piggly Wiggly stores were failing, they reasoned, then rumors could be spread that would lead the uninformed public to believe that the parent firm was failing too. To further this belief, they began briskly selling Piggly Wiggly short in order to force the price down. The stock yielded readily to their pressure, and within a few weeks, its price, which earlier in the year had hovered around $50 a share, dropped to below $40. At this point, Saunders announced to the press that he was about to beat the Wall Street professionals at their own game with a buying campaign. He was by no means a professional himself. In fact, prior to the listing of Piggly Wiggly, he had never owned a single share of any stock quoted on the New York Stock Exchange. There's little reason to believe that at the beginning of his buying campaign, he had any intention of trying for a corner. It seems more likely that his announced motive, the unassailable one of supporting the price of the stock in order to protect his own investment and that of other Piggly Wiggly stockholders, was all he had in mind. In any case, he took on the bears with characteristic zest, supplementing his own funds with a loan of about $10 million from a group of bankers in Memphis, Nashville, New Orleans, Chattanooga, and St. Louis. Legend has it that he stuffed his $10 million plus in bills of large denomination into a suitcase, boarded a train for New York, and, his pockets bulging with currency that wouldn't fit in the suitcase, marched on Wall Street ready to do battle. He emphatically denied this in later years, insisting that he had remained in Memphis and masterminded his campaign by means of telegrams and long-distance telephone calls to various Wall Street brokers. Wherever he was at the time, he did round up a core of some 20 brokers, among them Jesse L. Livermore, who served as his chief of staff. Livermore, one of the most celebrated American speculators of this century, was then 45 years old, but was still occasionally and derisively referred to by the nickname he had earned a couple of decades earlier, the Boy Plunger of Wall Street. Since Saunders regarded Wall Streeters in general and speculators in particular as parasitic scoundrels intent only on battering down his stock, it seemed likely that his decision to make an ally of Livermore was a reluctant one, arrived at simply with the idea of getting the enemy chieftain into it. His own camp. On the first day of his duel with the Bears, Saunders, operating behind his mask of brokers, bought 33,000 shares of Piggly Wiggly, mostly from the short sellers. Within a week, he had brought the total to 105,000. More than half of the 200,000 shares outstanding. Meanwhile, ventilating his emotions at the cost of tipping his hand, he began running a series of advertisements in which he vigorously and pungently told the readers of Southern and Western newspapers what he thought of Wall Street. "Shall the gambler rule?" he demanded in one of these effusions. "On a white horse he rides. Bluff is his coat of mail, and thus shielded is a yellow heart. His helmet is deceit, his spurs clink with treachery, and the hoofbeats of his horse thunder destruction. Shall good business flee? Shall it tremble with fear? Shall it be the loot of the speculator?" On Wall Street, Livermore went on buying Piggly Wiggly. The effectiveness of Saunders' buying campaign was readily apparent. By late January of 1923, it had driven the price of the stock up over 60 or higher than ever before. Then, to intensify the Bear Raiders' jitters, reports came in from Chicago, where the stock was also traded, that Piggly Wiggly was cornered, that the short sellers could not replace the stock they had borrowed without coming to Saunders for supplies. The reports were immediately denied by the New York Stock Exchange, which announced that the floating supply of Piggly Wiggly was ample, but they may have put an idea into Saunders' head, and this in turn may have prompted a curious and, at first glance, mystifying move he made in mid-February, when, in another widely disseminated newspaper advertisement, he offered to sell 50,000 shares of Piggly Wiggly stock to the public at $55 a share. The ad pointed out, persuasively enough, that the stock was paying a dividend of $1 4 times a year, a return of more than 7%. This is to be a quick proposition, subject to withdrawal without prior notice. The ad went on calmly but urgently. To get in on the ground floor of any big proposition is the opportunity that comes to few, and then only once in a lifetime. Anyone who is even slightly familiar with modern economic life can scarcely help wondering what the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is charged with seeing to it that all financial advertising is kept factual, impersonal, and unemotional, would have had to say about the hard sell in those last two sentences. But if Saunders' first stock offering ad would have caused an SEC examiner to turn pale, his second, published 4 days later, might well have induced an apoplectic seizure. A full-page affair, it cried out in huge black type. Opportunity! Opportunity! It knocks! It knocks! It knocks? Do you hear? Do you listen? Do you understand? Do you wait? Do you act now? Has a new Daniel appeared, and the lions eat him not? Has a new Joseph come that riddles may be made plain? Has a new Moses been born to a new promised land? Why then, asks the skeptical, can Clarence Saunders be so generous to the public? After finally making it clear that he was selling common stock and not snake oil, Saunders repeated his offer to sell at $55 a share, and went on to explain that he was being so generous because, as a far-sighted businessman, he was anxious to have Piggly Wiggly owned by its customers and other small investors rather than by Wall Street sharks. To many people, though, it appeared that Saunders was being generous to the point of folly. The price of Piggly Wiggly on the New York Stock Exchange was just then pushing 70. It looked as if Saunders were handing anyone who had $55 in his pocket a chance to make $15 with no risk. The arrival of a new Daniel, Joseph, or Moses might be debatable, but opportunity certainly did seem to be knocking. All right, actually, as the skeptical must have suspected, there was a catch. In making what sounded like such a costly and unbusinesslike offer, Saunders, a rank novice at corner, had devised one of the craftiest dodges ever used in the game. One of the great hazards in corner was always that even though a player might defeat his opponents, he would discover that he had won a Pyrrhic victory once the short sellers had been squeezed dry. That is, the cornerer might find that the reams of stock he had accumulated in the process were a dead weight around his neck. By pushing it all back into the market in one shove, he would drive its price down close to zero. And if, like Saunders, he had to borrow heavily to get into the game in the first place, his creditors could be expected to close in on him and perhaps not only divest him of his gains, but drive him into bankruptcy. Saunders apparently anticipated this hazard almost as soon as a corner was in sight, and accordingly made plans to unload some of his stock before winning instead of afterward. His problem was to keep the stock he sold from going right back into the floating supply, thus breaking his corner, and his solution was to sell his $55 shares on the installment plan. In his February advertisements, he stipulated that the public could buy shares only by paying $25 down and the balance in three $10 installments, due June 1st, September 1st, and December 1st, and December 1st. In addition, and vastly more important, he said he would not turn over the stock certificates to the buyers until the final installment had been paid. Since the buyers obviously couldn't sell the certificates until they had them, the stock could not be used to replenish the floating supply. Thus, Saunders had until December 1st to squeeze the short sellers dry. Easy as it may be to see through Saunders' plan by hindsight, his maneuver was then so unorthodox that for a while neither the governors of the stock exchange nor Livermore himself could be quite sure what the man in Memphis was up to. The stock exchange began making formal inquiries, and Livermore began getting skittish. But he went on buying for Saunders' account and succeeded in pushing Piggly Wiggly's price up well above 70. In Memphis, Saunders sat back comfortably. He temporarily ceased singing the praises of Piggly Wiggly stock in his ads and devoted them to eulogizing apples, grapefruit, onions, hams, and Lady Baltimore cakes. Early in March, though, he ran another financial ad, repeating his stock offer and inviting any readers who wanted to discuss it with him to drop in at his Memphis office. He also emphasized that quick action was necessary. Time was running out. By now, it was apparent that Saunders was trying for a corner, and on Wall Street was not only the Piggly Wiggly bears who were becoming apprehensive. Finally, Livermore, possibly reflecting that in 1908 he had lost almost $1 million trying to get a corner in cotton, could stand it no longer. He demanded that Saunders come to New York and talk things over. Saunders arrived on the morning of March 12th. As he later described the meeting to reporters, there was a difference of opinion. Livermore, he said, and his tone was that of a man rather set up over having made a piker out of the boy plunger, gave me the impression that he was a little afraid of my financial situation and that he did not care to be involved in any market crash. The upshot of the conference was that Livermore bowed out of the Piggly Wiggly operation, leaving Saunders to run it by himself. Saunders then boarded a train for Chicago to attend to some business there. At Albany, he was handed a telegram from a member of the stock exchange who was the nearest thing he had to a friend in the White Charger, and coat, mail set. The telegram informed him that his antics had provoked a great deal of head shaking in the councils of the exchange, and urged him to stop creating a second market by advertising stock for sale at a price so far below the quotation on the exchange. At the next station, Saunders telegraphed back a rather unresponsive reply. If it was a possible corner the exchange was fretting about, he said, He could assure the governors that they could put their fears aside since he himself was maintaining the floating supply by daily offering stock for loan in any amount desired. But he didn't say how long he would continue to do so. A week later, on Monday, March 19, Saunders ran a newspaper ad stating that his stock offer was about to be withdrawn. This was the last call. At the time, or so he claimed afterward, he had acquired all but 1128 of Piggly Wiggly's 200,000 outstanding shares for a total of 198,872, some of which he owned and the rest of which he owned and the rest of which he controlled, a reference to the installment plan shares whose certificates he still held. Actually, this figure was open to considerable argument. There was one private investor in Providence, for instance, who alone held 1,100 shares. But there is no denying that Saunders had in his hands practically every single share of Piggly Wiggly then available for trading, and that he therefore had his corner. On that same Monday, it is believed, Saunders telephoned